Nora Sheehan was a 54-year-old mother of three who lived with her husband James in Ballyfahan on the south side of Cork City. Ballyfahan is one of the oldest suburbs in Cork and was created as part of a post-World War II initiative to create a model community in Cork. Nora was born on the 27th of March 1927 and was the eldest of 10 children and grew up in Crookstown in County Cork. James, Nora's husband, was 24 years older than her. They met when Nora was lodging in a house with his sister. When they got married, the couple had 3 sons, James Jr., Jeremiah and Hugh. Nora had previously worked in a nearby psychiatric hospital as a carer. She would work nights and James would work days, so someone was always home with the children. She was a great cook, loved to go for her walks, and a gentle soul who loved children and animals. Her family would describe her as her own individuality, but a fierce, kind person who would talk to everyone she met. If a neighbour died, she would go and help lay that person out, something she learned how to do from a young age, being from the countryside. Her son Jeremiah would also say she was a great washerwoman, in days before we had the luxury of washing machines. In 1973, Nora suffered a fall in work, and after this she developed some psychiatric problems of her own. Nora was a familiar sight on the local roads. She would attempt to wave down cars and talk to people about the goings-on in the hospital. Her neighbours would hear her shout, quote, "Open the boots and let out the bodies." James, her son, would later tell the court his mother had a habit of waving down traffic, something he put down to her growing up in the countryside, where everyone used to pick everyone up for a lift. He also described Nora as a bit eccentric, and she would freely speak her mind. On Saturday, the 6th of June 1981, 2 dogs had gotten into a fight near Nora's home and she was bitten on her left arm as she tried to separate them. After this incident, Nora walked to the casualty department at South Infirmary, Victoria University Hospital, where a nurse treated her for the significant wound she had sustained. Nora did not want her injuries sutured, so she was given a tetanus injection. The wound was applied with an antibiotic spray and dressed. Nora was so thankful to the nurses that attended to her that she wanted to leave them money in the donation box. The nurse would later recall also that Nora was dressed formally in a blue coat and a dress and was carrying a bag. She also said that she wore a hat with a blue ribbon, which she kept putting on and off in an agitated way. The nurse also described Nora, in her eyes, as a vulnerable person. Nora left the hospital and was seen by many people as she made her way home. It was now around 10 p.m. A girl and her boyfriend who knew Nora saw her leave the hospital grounds as they sat in their car at the traffic lights near the hospital. They said she was standing at the junction, waving at cars. At around 1:30 a.m, another man was driving home from work when he saw Nora standing at the junction of Vickers Road and the Tuher Road in Cork City. He also said she was waving at cars as they passed by, but also said he was familiar with this. It was just a thing she did. She was eccentric. The last sighting of Nora was at around 4:05 a.m. on the 7th of June. A man left his girlfriend's house and saw a woman in a long overcoat on Vicker Street waving at cars. 3 days later, on June the 9th, James, Nora's son, was on holidays with his in-laws' family, but would go to work every day. He was contacted by a local shop owner telling him he needed to go at home as his father needed him. When James got home, he found his father in distress and he was told that his mother was missing for the last 3 days. The 2 men went to Tuher Garda station and filed a missing person report on Nora. A missing person investigation began straight away and it was announced that Nora was a vulnerable person and in need of medical care. On the 12th of June, 2 men that were forestry workers had been in a rural woodland called Shipple Woods. They were there searching for dumped rubbish when they found what they initially thought was a dead pig, before realising they had discovered the body of a woman. They had seen a blue coat around 20 yards down a slope towards the River Bandon, and they could get a smell of stench as they moved down towards the area. The body was lying on its right-hand side, with the hands laid out in front. The woman had visible bruising and her dress had been pushed up around her head and her tights were around her ankles. The body would later be identified as poor Nora Sheehan. On discovering the body, the two men went immediately to the local Garda station to report what they had found. Garda O'Sullivan was the only Garda on duty in the village when the men arrived, and as they were not equipped with walkie-talkies at the time, he deputised his wife to accompany him to the scene. The Garda drove the two men and his wife back along a twisting section of road 2.5 miles until they pulled up at an area known as the viewing point. Garda O'Sullivan went over the wall and down the slope and made a pathway using a hurley. When he got to where the body was lying, he waved the hurley to scatter the blue bottles that had settled there. There were signs also that animals had taken to it, as the body had been lying exposed to the elements for at least 6 days at this point. At 5 p.m, a priest arrived at the scene and gave the last rites. By happens, a forensic scientist, Dr. Timothy Creedon, was in County Cork when the body was recovered by Gardaí, just miles from where he was holidaying at Inishannon. He attended the scene in Shipwell Woods in an observational capacity. When Dr. Creedon returned from his trip, he was tasked with examining swabs taken from Nora. He found semen on a vaginal swab retrieved. It was preserved on a microscopic slide and later archived in a large cabinet in the Forensic Science Laboratory. When Nora's body was discovered, it did not make big headlines as it would today. There was a lot going on in the early 80s. 1981 was a different time, dominated by hunger strikes and a general election, which saw a political power swing from Fianna Fáil to a coalition of Fine Gael and Labour. The murder of Nora was front page news for a time, stating that her hat, her handbag and shoes were never found. But besides this, the Gardaí were also doing a bad job when it came to keeping evidence. Over the years, her coat, dress and plastic coverings went missing. But they did manage to hold on to one important piece of evidence, and that was the swabs taken of foreign substance found on Nora. It would be more than 30 years before advances in DNA would reap its rewards. But in 1981, some scientific analysis could be carried out. Fibres from Nora's coat and dress were recovered and analysed. Sadly, not long after Nora's murder, an investigating Garda on the case died, and the local pathologist that had examined Nora's body died 2 months later also. He had not completed his findings and had not signed off on his report, so it could not be used as evidence in court at that time if they were to find a person responsible for the murder. On the morning of the 16th of June, 4 days after Nora's body was found, Detective Inspector Matthew Thorne stopped a 32-year-old man as he drove his Opel Kadett car on the Curraheen Road in Bishopstown, County Cork. He was stopped for an unrelated incident which involved the robbery of a local post office. So who was this man? His name was Noel Long, and his long descent into criminality had begun as a teenager. Growing up at Liam Lynch Park on Glasheen Road on Cork's south side, he was the eldest of 5 sons and 2 daughters, born to Noel Long Sr. and his wife Nellie, and the only one to lead a life of crime. The Longs were a decent family. Noel Sr. was a good plumber and one of the first to start installing central heating in Cork, and Nellie was a lovely woman. But Noel Jr. went off the rails very early on. He was an apprentice welder and got his first conviction at the age of 17 when he pleaded guilty at Cork District Court to stealing cars and the robbery of jewellery in February 1966. He was given 9 months detention in St. Patrick's Institution. Upon his release, Long headed to the UK, but he was soon in trouble again, pleading guilty to robbery after he broke into 3 houses and stole property worth £117 and a van. He avoided a jail term by agreeing to return to Ireland. So Long returned to Cork, and sometime after he travelled to Ballymena in County Antrim to join the Royal Irish Rangers and returned to the UK with the regiment in 1969, despite having given an undertaking to the court in June of 67 not to return to the UK for 3 years. By September 1969, then aged 20, he again appeared before British courts, this time charged with burglary and indecently assaulting a young woman in a house at Catterick Army Camp in Yorkshire while stationed there with his regiment. He was arrested and was being held at Richmond Police Station in Yorkshire when he managed to escape through a hole in the roof, triggering a manhunt involving 3 helicopters, 50 police and tracker dogs, before being recaptured a few days later at Hinckley in Leicestershire. At his trial in October 1969, it emerged that Long, a fitness fanatic, had climbed up a drain pipe of the house of his commanding officer, a colonel, and broken into an upstairs room. The colonel's 18-year-old daughter woke up to find him lying across her bed, and he kissed her on the mouth. Long was identified as the intruder when a fingerprint was found on the window as he fled after the girl cried out for help. Some 800 officers and men at the camp were fingerprinted. His print proved a match, leading to him being charged with the offences. Long's plea of not guilty to the indecent assault was accepted by the prosecution after he pleaded guilty to common assault and to the theft of a car in Wakefield as he fled. He was sentenced to 6 months' detention, which he served before leaving the British Army and returning to Ireland. When Long returned to Ireland, he finished his apprenticeship as a welder in Cork, but soon came to the attention of Gardaí while living in Tuathair in 1971. He was charged with having unlawful carnal knowledge of a girl in Youghal and got a 12-month sentence at Cork Circuit Criminal Court. He did marry and had 2 children in the 70s, but later became estranged from them. By the time Nora was murdered, Long's reputation for sexual offending made him a prime suspect for the rape and murder of Nora. When Long was stopped and brought in for questioning about the post office robbery, they also seized his car, and a forensic examination was done on it. At that time, there was no power of arrest for murder, and after 2 interviews, one on the 16th of June and one when he came in voluntarily on the 6th of July, Gardaí obtained directions from the DPP to charge him with Nora's murder. Fibres from the car that had been taken matched the fibres found in Nora's clothes as well as on her body. Long had denied in interviews that Nora had ever been in his car, and he was not in the area that Nora disappeared from or where she had been found. But a witness would come forward that said he was to meet Long in the pub near to where Nora was found, only he never showed up on the night in question. Long was charged on the 7th of July 1981 in the Bridewell Garda station and remanded in custody to appear at a full court sitting before he later got High Court bail. The Gardaí had their man. But the state's case against Long suffered a major blow just a month later when the pathologist who carried out the post-mortem, Dr. Dermot Coakley, died suddenly. This meant that his findings regarding how Nora died were no longer admissible in evidence, as he had not done up an official report and signed off on it. The DPP then came to the decision that not enough evidence was available to them to pursue a prosecution, and so the charges were dropped and Long walked free. Long wasn't to stay off the Gardaí's radar for long. The following year, a woman in her 20s from Dublin was hitchhiking to Kinsale in County Cork on the bank holiday weekend, when she got a lift from a man in a mint green Volkswagen camper van, the type of van Long was driving at the time. The man took the woman out to the car park at Charles Fort in Kinsale, beat her and attempted to strangle her, before raping her and dumping her at the side of the road just outside Kinsale at around 4 a.m. Gardaí were alerted and the woman was taken to hospital in Cork, where she was treated for her injuries. Medically examined and DNA samples were taken in the hope of being able to identify her attacker. The woman gave a 26-page statement, described the man who attacked her and the van he was driving. The Gardaí knew it was Long, but the woman was so traumatised she didn't want to proceed with the complaint and fled to the UK, and so Long got off again. Over the coming years, Long had convictions from common assault as well as various road traffic convictions. In 1991, he was back in Cork Circuit Criminal Court after he was charged with indecently assaulting a woman. Seemingly, he called to a woman's house in the Fermoy area of County Cork in 1989. This woman, in her early 30s, opened the door to Long after he asked her for a glass of water. He indecently assaulted her. The woman had special needs and had poor verbal skills. Although she was able to point Long out as her attacker, she was unable to be cross-examined during a pre-trial hearing, and the DPP was forced to enter a stay on criminal proceedings. 10 more years would pass before Gardaí would get a conviction on Long. He had been a keen diver and biker, who in general kept a low profile since moving to Passage West in County Cork in the late 1990s. But on the 14th of August 2011, he would attack his sister at Cork University Hospital as their mother lay dying in the hospital bed beside them. He was found guilty of engaging in threatening and abusive behaviour and given a 3-month suspended sentence. He was then back in court 2 years later in 2013. At the age of 65, Long was convicted of assault causing harm to a man outside his house in Passage West. When he hit the man with an iron bar on the head, Long was sentenced to 12 months in prison. In 2008, a Garda cold case unit was set up to investigate unresolved murders, and Nora's case was one of them. On the 13th of July 2023, Long would find himself in court once more. This would be for the murder of Nora Sheehan. Long was granted bail and he would get the train home every day during the trial. The case would rely heavily on advances in forensics and DNA profiling over the intervening 40 years since the killing to finally link Long to the murder of Nora. The trial heard evidence from expert Dr. Jonathan Whittaker from Forensic Science Services in the UK that a partial profile generated from semen found on the body of Nora and preserved for decades had matched DNA found on a beanie hat obtained from Long in 2021 after a search of his house. The previous evidence of fibres was also put forward, along with witnesses putting Long in the areas where Nora went missing and was found. Paint fragments removed from Nora's clothes also match paint taken from Long's car. New legislation in recent years allowed the pathologist's unfinished report on Nora to be given to the jury with the help of Dr. Coakley's assistant. She confirmed to the court that it was his handwriting, and she was asked to read out the report, proving that she was familiar with his writing from reading his reports over the years when she worked with him. Former state pathologist Dr. Mary Cassidy, who was called by the defence, gave evidence that Nora's cause of death was unascertained. There was no evidence she was strangled. She agreed with prosecution lawyers that death from asphyxia by one of two methods could not be proved or disproved. Dr. Cassidy said it also could not be excluded that Nora had suffered a heart attack due to cardiac arrhythmia during an assault or that she could have been suffocated. Dr. Cassidy also said it was possible she had been sexually assaulted since Nora was found unclothed and with injuries to her private area. The closing statement of the prosecution said the evidence all pointed to the inescapable conclusion that Nora met her death in 1981 at the hands of Long. He told the jurors they were being asked to infer that after Nora was last seen alive, she came to be in his car, was badly assaulted and sexually assaulted, and was ultimately killed in the course of a vicious assault or to cover up her murderer's misdeeds. The defence in closing said the case was wholly dependent on forensic science and there was nothing else to connect Long to Nora. Counsel said the prosecution had failed to prove the intent required for murder, and in those circumstances the most the jury could consider is a verdict of manslaughter. However, the panel of 7 men and 4 women unanimously accepted the prosecution's case and found Long guilty of Nora's murder on the 4th of August 2023, after deliberating for just over 5 hours. All in all, Long had 31 convictions in his lifetime, not taking into account the crimes he got away with. The jury was unaware of his previous criminal history, and so their verdict was based solely on the evidence and not who he really was. This case made Irish legal history, as it was the longest span, at 42 years, between a murder being committed and a conviction being secured, which carries an automatic life sentence. Of course, Long's legal team lodged an appeal days after he was convicted, and this has still to be decided on. The Sheehan family made a short statement after the trial was over. They thanked the Gardaí and the people who helped bring justice to Nora after 42 years. They also thanked the jury for their guilty verdict. They said that Nora is now at peace, and so is her husband James, who died 4 years after the murder. Rest in peace, Nora.